Video on solving equations. Now this is sort of the second phase, because now we're going to solve equations that involve fractions. And often people are afraid of fractions, but I'm going to walk you through how to solve equations that have fractions, and hopefully you can even play the video a couple of times, and hopefully by the end you'll be okay. So for easiest one involving fractions, so I'll use the variable x. Let's say you have this x over 3, so fraction x over 3. This means x divided by 3 equals 5 over 2. So we've got a fraction on each side. There are two ways to think of how to solve this equation. The first one is, when we learned in elementary school how to deal with fractions, we put everything over a common denominator. We made these two the same. And the way we did that is we said, what is a number that 3 goes into and 2 goes into, leaving no remainder? So for 3 and 2, that number is 6. 6 divided by 3 is a whole number, and 6 divided by 2 is a whole number. No remainders. So 6 is called our common denominator. What we did in elementary school is we rewrote these fractions as something over 6. When solving equations, we're using the common denominator, but not exactly like that. What we do is, I'm going to write this down. Lowest common denominator is 6, okay? What we do is we multiply both sides by the lowest common denominator, and something good will happen. Watch this. If I take the left side and multiply it by 6, and there's my equal sign, I must do the same thing to the other side, multiply it by 6. I get this. Now, why is this good? This looks more complicated, but watch what happens. This 6 and this 3, you can think of them as the fraction 6 over 3, like 6 over 3 like this. And in elementary school, you learned that fractions can be reduced. 6 over 3, we can take the top and the bottom and divide them both by 3. And when you do that, you get 2 on top and 1 on the bottom. So the fraction 6 over 3 actually can be reduced or simplified to 2 over 1. So if we consider that this 6 is up on top in the numerator, the 3 is in the denominator, that's really like a fraction 6 over 3. And I can reduce that by dividing top and bottom by 3. And I have this. And then on the right side, I'll do the same thing. I have a 6 in the numerator, a 2 in the denominator. So I can reduce that, divide top and bottom by 2, and I'm left with 3 over 1. Notice what happens now. I have 1 in the denominator on both sides. A fraction over 1 is really just a whole number. For example, if I had 10 over 1, that's really the same as just 10. So this is good. What I've just done now is I have cleared the fractions. Clear the fractions. And if you're in my class, you'll be hearing me use this language, clear the fractions. So now, when you multiply fractions, you multiply straight across. This 2 is like a 2 over 1. So 2 in the numerator, 1 in the denominator. I'm not going to write it because we don't need it. We know it's there. And you multiply straight across. So 2 times x is 2x. And this 1 under here times this 1 is 1. We don't bother writing 1 in the denominator because that's just a whole number, so we leave it. On the other side, we have 3 times 5, which is 15, also over 1, and I'm not going to write it because it's not needed. So now I have 2x equals 15, and look what I did. I have cleared the fractions. They're gone. There's no denominators. This turns into a one-step equation. Excuse me. And so to get rid of the times 2, I'll divide by 2, but do it to both sides. And then on the left side, these two will cancel, and I get x equals 15 over 2. You can leave it as a fraction if you like that, if your teacher requires it. Or you can use your calculator, 15 divided by 2, and get x equals 7.5. Okay, so an equation that had fractions, by clearing the fractions, multiplying by the lowest common denominator, and reducing, we can change that into a simple equation that has no fractions. So let me increase the difficulty just a little bit. Okay, if you need to go see that again, you can always rewind the video and see it again. Here's another example. I'm going to change the variables just so we get used to not always x. Okay. Now I've got a fraction on one side, and not only a fraction, but it's got an expression, like with algebra, that we're going to work with. On the other side, I have a whole number, but that's okay because the whole number is just 5 over 1. And I'm not even going to need that one, so I'll show you what to do here. What we have to do is clear the fractions. The only denominator is 2. This 5 is sitting on top of a 1. So what is the lowest common denominator for these two? It's 2. So I'm just going to write it over here. The lowest common denominator is 2. It's the smallest number that 2 divides into and 1 divides into with no remainder. So now we multiply both sides by the lowest common denominator, just like this. So remember, I'm always using brackets to show multiplication. We don't use x anymore like times because it looks like a variable x and it's confusing. So get used to seeing the brackets all the time. Now what happens, this 2 and this 2 are going to cancel each other out. It's like the fraction 2 over 2. The fraction 2 over 2 reduces to just 1. So now this 2 and this 2 will reduce to 1 and 1. And I've already cleared the fractions because the only denominator is 1. Now, we have to multiply this out. This is 1 times w plus 1. But that's just w plus 1. And 2 times 5 is 10. Right? How do we get rid of the 1? Well, we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. And I'm going to have w on the left and 9 on the right. And that's it. So the whole idea of clearing the fractions makes your equation much, much easier. Okay, now I'm going to do 2 more examples, and with each one we're going to increase the difficulty just a little bit. So here's your example 3. I'm going to use a new variable u, and now 2 fractions on the left side and a whole number on the right side. Now we already know that this whole number 1 is really just 1 over 1. So when I'm finding the lowest common denominator, I need the lowest number, the smallest number that 3 divides into and 2 divides into, and 1 will divide into everything. So we're really just looking at these two with no remainder. And that number is 6. Okay, so that's my lowest common denominator. Now, multiplying both sides by the lowest common denominator means multiplying everything on each side by the lowest common denominator. So that means this first fraction is multiplied by 6. And the second fraction is multiplied by 6. And also on the right side, because what you do to one side you must do to the other. So even that little lonely 1 is multiplied by 6. And now you can see the equation is still true because I've done the same thing to each part of the equation. The 6 and the 3 can now reduce. 2 and 1, that's dividing both numbers by 3. The 6 and the 2 can also reduce by dividing both numbers by 2. And I'm left with 3 and 1. What have I done? I've cleared the fractions. So let me write that again. Clear the fractions. You know your fractions are clear when all of the denominators are 1. That means you have whole numbers. Now we multiply across. 2 times u is 2u. Now down below I have this 1 times 1, so I don't bother writing it. So that's 2u plus 3u equals 6 times 1 is 6. Now, collecting like terms, 2u plus 3u is 5u equals 6. How do you get rid of times 5? You do the opposite, so divide by 5. So 5u divided by 5. Do the same thing on the other side, equals 6 divided by 5. So u equals 6 divided by 5. Or, if you're going to use decimals, just take your calculator, 6 divided by 5, you get 1.2. Okay, so look how complicated the original equation was, and then look how we got there by clearing the fractions. Okay, last example, and this one's going to be the hardest looking one, but the steps are exactly the same. Okay, so now I'm going to use m. I'm going to throw new numbers in there. I'm also going to put a minus, so that's going to force us to be very careful. 3 equals 2. Okay, so now it's looking a little bit more complex, but the method is the same. Remember, this 2 is over 1. So my lowest common denominator has to be the smallest number that 5 divides into and 3 divides into with no remainder. Okay, that number is 15. Okay, at the very worst, you could always multiply these two to get your denominator, but it may not always be the lowest. In this case, that is the lowest number that's divisible by 5 and 3. We take our lowest common denominator and multiply each piece of the equation by it. And don't forget this number on the right side that is not a fraction, just sitting there. Here's the clear the fraction part. If you have a fraction 15 over 5, how do you reduce that? Well, look for a number that divides into both. This denominator will always work, so divide top and bottom by 5 and you get 3 over 1. So that is reduced. So we're going to reduce this 15 and the 5, divide them both by 5, and you get 3 and 1. Now this 15 and the 3, divide them both by 3, and you get 5 and 1. And we have cleared the fractions. Right? All the denominators are 1. So now multiply across. 3 times m is 3m. Now, minus 5 times m plus 1. Okay, I would recommend don't even try to do that in your head. Just write it out. We can always take care of it in the next step. 15 times 2, you can use a calculator if you need it, or if you know, it's 30. Okay, and now it's a matter of expanding this. So using that distributive property to expand, multiply that negative 5 by both of those terms in the bracket. So 3m. So negative 5 times m is negative 5m. And now negative 5 times 1 is still a negative number. It's negative 5. And that's 30. We have cleared the fractions. We've gone from this complicated thing to this much, much less complicated equation. But there's still stuff we can do to simplify. Collecting like terms, 3m minus 5m is negative 2m. And then we're going to get rid of the negative 5. So you can think of it as moving negative 5 to the other side, and it becomes positive if you're comfortable with that. But really what's happening is that we are undoing subtracting 5. The opposite of subtracting 5 is adding 5. But I have to do it to both sides. Okay? This side over here, the negative 5 and a positive 5 together make 0, so they go away. And I have negative 2m equals 35. Divide both sides by negative 2. And I have m equals negative 35 over 2, or with decimals, m equals negative 17.5. And don't be afraid of decimals. You will see decimals. Not everything's a whole number in math. Don't assume just because you have a decimal that you're wrong. That does happen a lot, and negative numbers too. Okay, so that's your lesson on solving equations with fractions. Remember the key thing, find the lowest common denominator, multiply everything by it, and reduce. That's clearing the fractions, and they'll be gone, and then you're just left with a two-step equation. Thank you.